So in this video, this is a follow-up to the Cedar City workshop. We didn't quite go through the background on Brat and RCAT in as much detail as we would have liked to during the workshop, so this is just to augment that. And what we want to really highlight is just a couple of tools and ways of thinking for considering where you might want to work. What we're going to do to start here is point out what we've been pointing out all along, that there's a lot of enthusiasm for this type of restoration, but how do we temper that constructively? Beaver or beaver assisted restoration or even beaver mimicry is not the answer everywhere, but it is the answer in a large number of places. And so what we want to have is a better handle on realistic expectation management, which gets back to this question of where can they work, where does it make sense, and particularly where are those going to be in places that are not causing unintended consequences or impacts. So what we're really going to use as the sort of backbone for this from a beaver-based perspective is what we're going to call a beaver dam capacity model. And what this is attempting to do is resolve where and to what degree beaver dams can be built and sustained. And so this is the sort of backbone, the primary model underlying the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, or BRAT. And so it's all about how many dams that you could get, if I could get this to advance, as opposed to how many beaver. And of course, there's more information on the model here at brat.riverscapes.xyz. That's an open source model. Anybody can run it, but as we'll show you, we've got outputs of this that we'll end up highlighting and using. Okay. So the capacity model has been vetted in McFarland 2016, and that's also available. So the reason we're going to focus on beaver dam capacity modeling is because beaver themselves are not actually what we're interested in. We're interested in their beaver dams because that's what provides all the feedbacks that we've been talking about and creates habitat for so many different species. And so while beaver can survive in a huge range of conditions, all they need is a little bit of water and then enough of a food source, typically woody materials are nice, but not even absolutely necessary. Where they choose to build dams to manipulate that environment is much more limited, as we've discussed during the workshop. And so beaver are not a very good thing to create a beaver habitat model for because they just aren't picky enough. But those the places where they do dam is something where we do stand a chance being able to model that spatially and discriminate that. And so this varies according to flow regime, availability of dam building materials, etc. And so what we try to ask in the capacity model, and just is really for sort of planning whether or not a particular location that you might want to use beaver or encourage beaver at is suitable as a dam building site. There's four basic questions. One, is there water there? We tend to focus on perennial sources of water, although we do know of situations where they can convert intermittent streams into perennial streams by manipulating the timing of runoff. Secondly, are there the vegetation resources available to support a dam building activity, which is typically woody, but there are plenty of examples of beaver building dams, not as many without the wood, but building dams with things like cattails and mud, sagebrush, etc. And then a pretty basic question, can beaver even build a dam at base flows? The example we use is the Grand Canyon, where there's plenty of beaver eking out an existence down there and bank lodging and doing just fine, but they certainly aren't building a dam across the Colorado River at base flows. And then finally, if beaver are able to build a dam, what's the likelihood that those dams withstand typical floods? And the anecdote we share here is up in Logan, Utah, the Logan River. There's a little class 4 or 5 section of fun whitewater, at least in spring runoff, that's just outside of town. And you look at that, especially during spring runoff, you think there's no way that beaver would build a dam there. Yet they do. They build it at base flows, and it seems to be one dam or a couple of dams that just keep getting rebuilt in the fall, and a beaver or a family colony there seems to survive through the winter, but every single spring it blows out. And so that's what we mean by its ability to withstand typical floods. Does it blow out, breach, or is it likely to stay intact? And so we went through these questions together. You guys did this. We answered this form. I think we did it for RETS, one of RETS sites that we zoomed into. And so this form that's also in your handout in the workshop notebook is basically the inference system, the rule table behind that capacity model. And what we do is we actually derive answers to this with a mix of remotely sensed and GIS data that's publicly available. You can get a more precise answer with higher resolution data, but what we found is you can get a pretty good approximate answer with freely available national data, which means when it comes to answering these questions about where to work, that we can do a pretty good job from sort of a planning and expectation management perspective for relatively cheap. And you can verify the performance of this sort of thing and or tweak the outputs to match what you're seeing on the ground if indeed there are weaknesses or inaccuracies in that nationally available data with just answering these questions yourself. Okay. And so this capacity model, what you end up with over here on the left, you end up with a network model. In this case, this is just showing the stream network. It's segmented or broken up into reaches, and each of those reaches get a different color that corresponds to, this is just how we symbolize the output, that corresponds to a range of dam density values. Okay, so red would be no dams could be supported, orange rare, yellow occasional 1 to 4 dams per kilometer, green frequent 5 to 15, and blue 16 to 40 dams per kilometer. And so you can see based off of availability of materials, et cetera, this is how that plays out. Okay. Over here is a couple of other components and some very conservative runs of those that are also part of BRAT. One is an idea of looking at where there's potential for conflict, and this is based off of the proximity to roads, crossings, railroads if they exist, culverts, and or particularly intense land uses like residential, agriculture, etc. And the basic logic is the higher the closer you are to any one of those types of conflict or potential conflict, then the higher the potential is for conflict. And then we have a management model, which is very provisional, and we'll walk through the logic on that, but it attempts to combine these different pieces of evidence to suggest areas where beaver, you don't really need to worry about them building dams, it's inappropriate. Areas where there might be some restoration potential versus areas where there is some capacity to support dam building activity, but there's also higher conflict. Okay. So, this is a product that now exists for the entire state of Utah. If you were to, if you were to go to our website, what you would find is you can download this, and I'll show you some of this in a moment. But for at least the perennial streams in Utah, which is what's shown here, these outputs are available for your use. And even in the second driest state in the United States, we have existing dam capacities that are quite high. Over about 40,000 kilometers of stream, we could fit about 356,000 dams in the current conditions. And we know that conditions could be improved, and indeed beaver can improve and expand and increase that capacity. So it's pretty impressive. This model, or at least the logic and the questions behind it, have been specifically rolled into the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources Beaver Management Plan in an update in 2017. And so it attempts to use this to help with that expectation management. Um, we went and saw Birch Creek. That's where we did our field exercises, etc. And so, because you got to see that on the ground, what I'm going to do is we'll just walk you through what these models spit out in a place that now you've all seen. One of the places you can engage with the model is databasin.org. I'm going to just open this up so that you can see this. Databasin.org has a bunch of GIS data on it that you can look at and download. Right here, you could download it if you're logged in, or you can just open it on a map. And so here we are. This will be loading up. And once this loads up, I will zoom in and show you how you can engage with that. Okay, so there it is, trying to load up all those pieces. And of course, we were down here just outside of Beaver, Utah, right? And so if we zoom in some more here, we can see we met just out of South Creek right here. So there was the gas station there, I believe. If I turn on, oh, where would it be? Imagery might be helpful here. So there's the Shell station, and there's Beaver Taco, and then we drove up this road. Now you'll notice that a bunch of South Creek is not modeled here. It's not included in this particular output. And the reason for that is because according to NHD, which may or may not match reality, but the National Hydrologic Dataset does not recognize those reaches as perennial. And so downstream of this reservoir, it shows up as intermittent. And then, of course, this is South Creek, and then right in here, this is Birch Creek. And so we did actually stop right here at this sort of intermittent portion of Birch Creek on the drive up. But then we drove out and across. So we drove up, 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 and then this is where we came across. And so you can see all of the removal from the PJ removal as part of the sage grouse habitat improvement project. Right up here is that ephemeral draw, and so because that was ephemeral, it's not included, right? But here's the perennial stream, and we parked right in here, and then this is basically the BRAT output. And you can see that some of the areas in yellow up here, we've got a lot more juniper. And so if I was to click on an individual segment, for example, oh, I need to hit I think, yeah, identify. So this gives me a whole bunch of information, but one of them, where is it? So it's giving me distances to road, and here's the existing dam capacity. So it's saying in this little segment we can basically fit one one dam, right? 0.665, right? That segment itself is, if we zoom up here, it's 250 meters long, and you can go through and look at each of these. Basically have a little hover over tip that tells you what the different various outputs are there. But what's symbolized is the capacity model. So now this blue is going to have a higher capacity. So if I go to, this has a capacity of 17.149 dams per kilometer. And in that particular 250 meter segment, it's saying it could fit about 4 dams in there. Okay, and so this kind of gives you a feel for what to expect, and you can zoom around to any part of the state that is mapped as perennial, and you can get an answer out of that. So that's one way you can interact with that just in a web browser. Okay, um, and this is basically what we're showing here. Another thing that's sort of a useful sort of planning expectation management tool is one of Sagegrouse Initiative's map.sagegrouseinitiative.com. And here I'm zoomed in for a portion of Birch Creek. So this is Birch Creek here. And I'm going to just go to this website to show you how this works, because I think it's a really useful tool. Now, the caveat here is not everywhere is mapped as showing these music resource polygons, but if your area does include them, this is a pretty cool little analysis that you can do. And so what we're looking at, these are polygons that have been shown to reliably over time basically be green. And so this is uses a normalized difference vegetation index that Jeremy Maestas spoke about. There's more information on that here and how that is done. But basically, the colors represent the percent of years, and that is from, let's see, from Landsat. I think it's going to tell us here from July 15th to September 30th from 1984 to 2016. Okay, so the percent of years from 84 to 2016 in the dry season that this is showing up as productive or green. And so this is sort of a synthesis of a bunch of data. And if we were, of course, to zoom in along along Birch Creek here, we'll see that the lower section right here is showing up with looks like 90% of the years productive, and then up in this area that's been cleared, 70%, and that's just based off of green. One of the cool things you can do is go back and you can look at specific years. So I could look at 1984, and this is basically late season productivity. I could, let's see, that's interesting. So here's different years. You can select years that you want to compare, or you can do a multi-year and you can hit all, and then you could play this. And what this is going to do, you can see here, this is an animation and it's going through, and you're seeing some years where it's relatively wet, more brown, or sorry, more greens, some years where it's drier, more lighter greens and browns, etc., etc. And so over time, this is just showing that landscape sort of breathing. And so here we are coming up 2008, 9, 10, uh, 14, it'd be 15, 16, 17. So that's kind of a cool little game you can play. You can also basically do a custom analysis. And in this, what you do is you draw a polygon around, let's say, the area that you're interested in. So I could use this portion of Birch Creek, for example. You can also upload a polygon if you like. So there's my polygon, and then I can hit calculate. And over here on the right, what it's doing is it's going through this whole record, and it's making me this little plot. And so this little plot is showing how NDVI has changed over time. And what's very interesting here, you're seeing this little bump. And this bump, I would speculate, is probably in the riparian, is probably associated with roughly the treatment time on the SGI. That's just me speculating from what I know about this area, but removal of that pinyon juniper was likely to result in more water availability down in that valley bottom in that riparian area. Okay. So that's a pretty cool tool at your disposal. Again, all you need is a web browser and to know where you want to go. And if we zoom into Birch Creek, now I'm going to kind of take you back to Brat, and I'm going to kind of walk you through a few things. And so we focused in this area on BLM land in the orange up here. That's where we were working. And you can see the intermittent streams mapped versus the perennial streams there, and that sort of land ownership gradient. And so what we can do is zoom in, kind of like we did in databasin.org, and here's a quick view of the existing capacity support dam building activity. And what we see is upstream of the road and where we didn't walk, occasional capacities, mainly due to a little bit smaller valley bottom and juniper encroachment, and then downstream a little bit higher capacities, and some of the highest right in the area where we were playing. And so again, this is a zoom in of that area. There's the road crossing that we were playing at. If we kind of zoom out, um, now this run right here is just based off of perennial, and that's what's publicly available. This is a provisional run, and so Beaver Creek is, or sorry, this is the Beaver Creek watershed, the whole thing. And then of course Beaver Creek goes up in through here, and this is South Canyon, and then we are playing up here in Birch Creek, or maybe this is Birch Creek. I'm sorry, it's right in there. And what this one is showing is a run of everything. And so this is includes intermittent and it includes ephemeral. So this is this is just to point out the contrast that there's a lot more potential capacity if water is available throughout the drainage network. And so this is kind of probably an overly optimistic versus a more conservative sort of estimate of what sort of capacities exist in that drainage network. All the same, it's useful, and what we're seeing on the left here is based off of existing or 2014 vegetation, whereas on the right, this is based off of an estimate of historic. And so you can see this red here in existing versus that green blue. And really what this is reflecting are the impacts of our current water use and land uses, and so points of diversion, etc., that have changed the vegetation availability, etc. Okay. So one simple thing that we can do to try and look at conflict, as mentioned before, or areas that we might want to be careful about is, anything that's close to, so right here is a little road and a culvert, might have a higher capacity for conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to be a problem per se. It's just an area that we might want to draw our attention to and be aware of. This is a place where there's a possibility of impacts by beaver that might be undesirable. Now, so here we're seeing low impact throughout most of this area, and the only two little high impacts where we're on BLM land are where there's road crossings. We get down into the lower watershed here along South Creek, and we see a lot higher impacts, and those have to do with proximity to higher intensity land uses like agriculture that could be adversely impacted, or commercial and retail and residential development. Okay, so that's a look at that just for Birch Creek and South Creek, whereas this is a look, throughout the entire catchment. And this is a very simplistic and conservative estimate, but that's helpful because if people are saying, "Oh, well, beaver are going to cause a bunch of problems," well, the majority of this network here is blue, and the areas that are red are fairly discrete and identifiable, and so we can, either recognize where those possibilities are and come up with agreements to help mitigate potential impacts in those. You can see this little band of red. That's clearly where a road is crossing the drainage network. Or we can try and, work primarily in the blues, a healthy distance, maybe a few kilometers away from some of those impacts. Okay? If we combine the capacity model, so where beaver could build dams, with that conflict, we can come up with some different categories. And so first in red and orange might be areas that are just, naturally limited or anthropogenically limited, and we don't expect beaver to be able to build dams right now. But in pink, green, and this white, we might have areas that the green are all you got to do is get beaver in and you're off to the races. The white might be areas, and so notice up here areas where we've got a lot of PJ, and you might need to get a little bit more riparian going before you could really support beaver in that area. So those are longer term restoration. In other cases, it could be getting a handle on grazing management. And then we have areas in blue, and yellow here, where either there's in blue a high capacity to support beaver dam building, but some potential for conflict, versus yellow, a lower capacity to support dam building activity, but also some potential for conflict. So you shouldn't take this as the answer, but it is helpful for identifying where some of the easiest opportunities versus a little bit longer term investment stuff might lie. It's also helpful for identifying areas like this yellow, right? Basically, there's high potential for conflict down in these areas because of the land use. However, it's showing up as yellow because the capacity to support beaver in these areas is pretty low, okay? Versus the few pockets of blue, this is kind of your, potentially your worst case scenarios, right? Another way, and this is provisional, that we can sort of combine those, and this is not what's available in the BRAT version 1 that's available for all of Utah, but we've run this in a few places. You can combine these things and have a slightly different look on this where we kind of don't use the conflict layer, but we're looking for where are the immediate returns versus a longer term investment. So that's a similar sort of logic to before. And it's kind of looking at how much capacity bump. And then it's breaking out the areas that don't look like they could provide much into the reasons for why. So a lot of these, because the riparian vegetation just simply doesn't exist. Those would be these browns. The orange, because we've so converted those areas and changed the land use so dramatically, it's very unlikely for us to get back versus areas where it's kind of slope to steep, some of these red or hydrologically limited. Okay, so that's kind of another useful way of looking at that, and this example is for the whole thing. Another model we have is called RCAT, and that stands for the Riparian Condition Assessment Tool. And in it is an output called VBET, or the Valley Bottom Extraction Tool. And what that attempts to do is map the valley bottom off of a 10-meter DEM. And so you can see here the valley bottom in Birch Creek, as you saw, was pretty narrow and pretty limited. All the same, we can get a pretty decent approximation of that. Once you get out here into the main valley, obviously that valley bottom is huge and much larger. But we talked in class about how modeling or looking at the valley bottom as the maximum plausible extent of riparian vegetation is really important. And you can see right here, this is that area where this widens out, where we put that strategic little BDA, and then it popped out that flow over to here and returned in. And so it's even picking up that opportunity there that, as we saw in the field, beaver once did as well. And then this is that intermittent, ephemeral draw where we did the one rock dams. Now, another way we can look at some of the vegetation data is we can look at where there's been a large departure from estimates of historic versus a small. And we can see up here where we had that lower capacity, quite a large departure. So more than 66% of the valley bottom that would have historically been predicted to have riparian vegetation now does not. And so it has different type of vegetation in this particular example. And so this is a pretty useful output just for kind of, where is your riparian in poor shape versus in decent shape relative to historic. And then this is a way of digging a little deeper into that and looking at why. And so what we see in this green area here is that there was a negligible to minor vegetation conversion. Basically, within the valley bottom, things are still looking pretty good. However, we look in this area, and it's this dark magenta, which is significant conifer encroachment. And so this is basically the pinyon juniper community moving in and occupying this valley bottom. And so in this case, as we kind of looked at in the field, what we think is going on is partly related to, fire suppression, but we've had, as we've seen in lots of the West, expansion of this pinyon juniper communities. You combine that with the extirpation of beaver from Birch Creek, we saw that the most of the valley bottom and floodplain surfaces that we saw were all structurally forced. They were stepped floodplains built by beaver. And this system has become too efficient of a drain. So it just takes that pathetic little zero point 0.1 CFS we saw out there and just efficiently drains that off the landscape. So it's structurally starved. So with that, we don't see the same sorts of extensive vegetation in much of this part of Birch Creek, riparian vegetation, and instead we see this encroachment by an upland species because the water availability with the lack of dams and wood in that system. Okay? So, in summary, when asking this question of where would you work, what I just tried to show you was these different tools, BRAT, RCAT, and then that map.sagegrassinitiative.com, which can allow you to, take a look at your site and take a look at your watershed and look at where the opportunities are. You need to think about what it is you're trying to do and achieve. And so in Birch Creek, we were trying to improve riparian habitat. And we were also trying to improve in-stream Bonneville cutthroat trout habitat. And so getting more beaver dams in there to diversify hydraulics would be one way of doing that. What are the impairments you're trying to address? Well, just looking at this last slide, it's clear that one of the impairments here is conifer encroachment. Okay. And what uplift, so what's the kind of, how much are you hoping to improve? Well, looking back at this valley bottom, right, that's the maximum sort of extent of footprint in an area where I would expect to improve it. But if I clip my, sort of expectations and my assessment down to that, there's a lot that you might be able to achieve. And of course, if you come back to uh, the contrast between existing and historic, well, then that gives you some expectation management on how big of an uplift you might be able to get. In terms of what risks to be aware of or mitigate and or avoid, we could come back to right here and say, yeah, well, there's a stream crossing there, so let's keep an eye out for that. There's a road crossing, another one down here. So if beaver were in the system, which they are not currently, we might be aware of them potentially going downstream and causing trouble in some of these higher conflict areas. And so we'd want to work with those landowners and just make them aware and have a system in place to mitigate those. However, a lot of the better habitat is upstream, and there's really no conflicts there, and so it's probably more likely that they would head up. So again, this allows us to just kind of approach that question of where you could work with a little bit of basic context and information to frame that discussion. So hopefully that's helpful, and if you have any questions, do feel free to get in touch. Take care.